astronomer, and I wanted to start this talk off by asking all of you guys, how do you picture the life of an astronomer? That's me again. Boop. And when I picture an astronomer, I picture this man right here, Dr. Michael Richmond. Dr. Richmond and I would spend 3 years together at an observatory in RAT in Rochester, New York. How many of you went to Rochester to see that solar eclipse?
Woo!
How many of you were disappointed? Because if there's two things you know about Rochester, it's that A, garbage plates are absolutely delicious. Yeah, the one person from Rochester, Henrietta Hotz or Nick Tahos. Oh, well, sorry, this is a picture from Henrietta Hotz. And B, that Rochester is very cloudy. That Rochester is very cloudy. So, yeah, that's an actual image during the eclipse. So most of my time at the observatory was actually spent practicing statistical calculations using baseball and playing Dance Dance Revolution to stay warm. During the day, I would knock on Dr. Richmond's door to find him like half asleep at his desk, toothbrush hanging out of his mouth, running a Python script, trying to get a light curve out of cloudy data. So to me, Dr. Richmond is like the classic astronomer. Sleepy, hygienic, and for whatever reason, using the same computer he had in 1999. But this talk is not about Dr. Michael Richmond. This talk is about an astronomer with a cosmic-sized personal life. This is about Tycho Brahe, your favorite stargazing, sword-wielding, pet elk-owning drinking buddy. So, to start off, Tycho was born in 1546, and I just need you to look at this baby. Like, it's an albino potato with some doilies crocheted around it.
Is that Tycho?
That is Tycho.
Oh, wow.
He had
That is our source.
his parents had a portrait painted of their baby?
They did, and they also let him get kidnapped by his uncle 2 years later.
Oh, by his uncle. All
So
right.
2 years later, Uncle Jorgen would kidnap Tycho, and his parents really didn't seem to mind that one of their brothers just stole their baby. So Tycho would grow up. I should mention he was born very wealthy. He would live with his wealthy uncle, and his uncle was training him with the intention of becoming a lawyer. But in 1559, Tycho would observe a total solar eclipse, not in Rochester, New York, and thus his fate as an astronomer was sealed. So in his years at university, Tycho took incredibly precise astronomical data, and keep in mind that at this time, astronomy looked very different than it does today because the telescope hadn't been invented yet. So Tycho took all of his data with the naked eye and with his own tools. He would famously build a quadrant, which is this device here, the size of a building that measured the angles and positions of stars. But what Tycho is most known for during his time at university is not his scientific contributions, but for a rousing night that occurred in 1566 when Tycho would get in a duel with his third cousin, Mandrip Parsberg, over, you guessed it, who was the better mathematician. Because swords are a way to prove you're good at math.
It adds up.
This is literally a drunken math duel.
National Lampoons presents.
The story gets even better when you realize that this duel happened at the house of one of their professors during said professor's engagement party. So this poor man was trying to celebrate his engagement while two of his students are dueling with swords in his basement. Tycho would lose part of his nose this night. And you would think getting into a duel over math and losing part of your nose would be enough for Tycho, but 19 days later, him and Mandrip Parsberg would finish their duel. And it's time for our second math duel. During this second math duel, Tycho would lose the rest of his nose.
So clearly the other guy was better at subtraction.
It's one of those things where, if this man had a nickel for every time he lost part of his nose in a duel, he'd have 10 cents, but it's weird that it happened twice.
It's also interesting because we know that we can really trust his scientific results if we're going by Pinocchio logic.
So I just have to imagine his fiance was like, your students aren't going to have a math duel tonight, right?
Not that I can picture.
I'm giving you a guarantee they will not.
No guarantees now. So Tycho would famously wear this prosthetic for the rest of his life, allegedly made out of gold and silver. And honestly, Tycho's nose would become a source of shame for him. One of the, I mean, come on. One of the bitterest scientific rivalries at the time was between Tycho and this man named Nicholas Reimers. Reimer's nickname was also Ursus, and both men would publish similar models of the universe at the same time. Tycho claimed that the long-nosed Ursus sniffed out his data. Ooh. Reimer's response was short, sweet, and as catty as could be. Bold words for a man with no nose.
Wow.
Even 441 years later, in the year 2007, Tycho's nose was still a topic of discussion, being described as the least desirable dueling scar. Luckily, Tycho would not need his nose to continue his astronomical work. So at the time in astronomy, people really imagined that the heavens were like these fixed, unchanging spheres that all orbited planet Earth. So you had these spheres of fixed stars with the Earth at the center. Tycho would observe two things that changed this model. One, he observed a comet that moved past the orbit of the moon, so a comet that could move between these spheres. He would also observe a supernova. You might have seen a picture of this remnant before in the constellation Cassiopeia. This was literally a new star in the sky that was brighter than the planet Venus. So it threw this idea that the heavens didn't change out the window. Tycho published his findings, and he would become this like astronomical rock star. His penchant for like getting drunk and lending out his pet elk really like probably helped his fame. And we don't really know where he got the elk. We don't really know what the elk's name was.
Do you have any kind of insight on which came first, losing the nose and getting the elk?
Losing the nose came first.
Yeah, because I would say elks smell pretty bad.
There we go.
That seems like a pet for a man with no nose.
It does seem like the great pet for a man with no nose. And, you know, might as well let other castles borrow it. So job offers started pouring in from all of the corners of Europe, and to keep Tycho in Denmark, the king offered him his own personal island with a state-of-the-art observatory known as Uranienborg. This is actually a place you can still visit in Denmark today. You can also visit the Lego house. And, love Legos. Tycho would use his tools to, I should mention, Tycho's observatory was worth 1% of the entire wealth of Denmark. Like, imagine a scientist today having 1% of the entire US budget. Imagine if Dr. Fauci had been handed 1% of the US budget to solve COVID. NASA's budget, for reference, is about 0.5% of the entire US budget. I didn't even bother calculating what percentage the observatory at RIT would be. That telescope was held together with Q-tips, tape, and the sheer will of force of one undergraduate. Desperate to get a clear night of data in Rochester, New York. So Tycho would actually use his tools at Uranienborg to track the motions of planets and stars across the entire sky. At the time, astronomers really only looked at specific bodies and unusual points in their orbit. And some of his measurements were accurate up to half an arc minute. So if you hold your pinky up to the sky, that's 1 degree. An arc minute is 1/60th of that.
This is how classy people look at the sky.
Cut your pinky in half first. And keep in mind, this is still before the invention of the telescope. Tycho's extensive stellar catalog would go on to be used by scientists like Newton to later prove their theories of gravitation. Tycho also came up with his own model of the universe at the time, which put the sun and moon in orbit around Earth, even as the other 5 known planets orbited the sun. And this was like a good in-between. There were people at the time who wanted to leave the current model behind, but weren't quite ready to accept this crazy Copernicus idea of the sun at the center of the solar system. So Tycho was a nice in-between. Even though Tycho had a lot of success at Uranienborg, he would eventually leave Denmark when he got in a disagreement with the new king of Denmark. Yes, it is time for our, oops, I clicked too fast. Third math duel.
Duel.
No, I'm just kidding. But he would go to Prague, and he would be contacted by Johannes Kepler, who would become his assistant. So Kepler and Tycho's relationship was a fraught one, like many of Tycho's relationships. Kepler wanted to use Tycho's data to prove Copernicus's idea rather than help Tycho refine his own model of the solar system. Kepler would go on 10 years after Tycho's death to publish his 3 laws of planetary motion, laws that I spent many cloudy nights studying and calculating at the observatory. Tycho would eventually die in 1601, and just like his life, his death is worth talking about. See, social customs at the time did not allow people to excuse themselves to go to the bathroom before their host. So Tycho was at a banquet one night. He drank a lot. He probably lent out his pet elk. And he really had to pee, but he refused to leave. According to Kepler, 5 days later, Tycho would die. And the idea is maybe that this exacerbated some kind of bladder infection he had. The story doesn't end there, though. In 1901, Tycho's body was exhumed, and they found unusual levels of mercury in his extensive mustache hairs. The thinking is that perhaps his jealous assistant Kepler poisoned him. Ooh. His body was exhumed again in 2010. And even though they found no signs of mercury in his mustache, they also did not find his nose. So this man lost his nose 3 times. Now he has 15 cents. So modern astronomers like Dr. Richmond and I have a lot to thank Tycho for. He's well earned having a crater on the moon, and it's a crater you can observe with your naked eye. This was a man who took incredible astronomical data with the naked eye while probably drunk on an elk with a sword. And that data would go on to be used by scientists like Kepler and Newton to change our understanding of the laws that governed the universe. From his pet elk to his math duels to his very Gen Z sounding name, Tycho Brahe. I think Tycho really epitomizes the theme of tonight and was truly starry, not sorry.
Thank you. Keep it going for Kate Schmidt.